here with Dr. Mark Moyar. I heard about you from Tucker Carlson. He did an interview with Russ Bott, who spoke about you. Also, you were on the Victor Davis Hanson podcast. Just to give the listeners a view of your credentials, you're currently the chair in military history at Hillsdale, excellent liberal arts university. You also graduated summa cum laude at Harvard, got a PhD at Cambridge. So my first question for you is, why would someone as smart as you work for the federal government? No, I'm just joking. That's not actually a real question. But thanks for coming on here. My real question is, you were in charge of a $300 million government budget, and your book is called Masters of Corruption. What is the worst corruption you've seen in the government, and should we even be surprised at this point?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, corruption takes a number of forms, and people tend to think about money being stolen from bank accounts, but it's actually not that much of that. People are more sophisticated. The worst corruption in terms of money that I saw involved contracting, and we had people who were employed by the agency were at the same time working or doing business for contractors that were getting the money. And there was all sorts of shady dealings. And so the biggest monetary fraud I saw was involved contracting. And I reported some of that, and actually led to the bureaucracy coming after me and not punishing the people who were actually in charge. But there's also corruption in terms of the bureaucracy defying the will of the American people. And I saw that too. You had unelected bureaucrats who believed they knew better than the elected officials what to do. And so they came up with lots of ways to try to frustrate the administration. We saw a lot of that in numerous agencies. My agency, they were particularly good when it came to concealing money, because there's a lot of money spent on programs that were approved by the Obama administration. Of course, we know almost all of the federal workforce voted Democrat in 2016, so they supported Obama policies and not Trump policies.
So to play devil's advocate, if people are saying, okay, it's a big bureaucracy, think there's going to be disagreements, things are going to happen, what would you say to highlight the reality of corruption, maybe a concrete example that you witnessed?
Yeah, so we had, in my office, I had deputies, the number 2 person. As soon as I came into the office, several people told me that this individual was the chairman of the board at a government contracting company and was using his job to get business for that company. And so I went to the authorities, told them about it. They launched an investigation, but basically all the investigation did was convince him to go to another federal agency where the investigation would go away. And he's still a senior official now at the Defense Department. And in the meantime, the security bureaucracy came after me on trumped up charges for having the gall to do this. And I ended up losing my job over it.
How does this happen logistically? It sounds like there's some collusion involved here. Like you're making a complaint about one person, then you get reprimanded by another person. Do you have a sense for how that communication takes place?
Yes, there are, in what I call sort of godfathers within the agency. You have senior career bureaucrats who have their own fiefdoms within the agency, and they have great influence. The person who I reported came under the fiefdom of a guy named Rob Jenkins, who was one of the top civil servant in USAID. That guy had also appointed the director of the Office of Security, or selected him for his job. And so he goes and turns to the head of the Office of Security and tells him to come after me. Same thing with agency lawyers. We had a network of career officials who were colluding. And now part of the problem too we had at our agency was that the political appointees were not well attuned to this. And so people who should have been standing up for me basically let the career bureaucrats destroy me because they didn't want to create enemies within this powerful bureaucratic apparatus.
Do you have a sense for how representative this corruption is in other government agencies?
It certainly can be seen at quite a few agencies. I don't know that we have or will ever get as much data as we should, but as I document in the book, you see, let's take the security clearance issue where they come after you on bogus charges. That has been done repeatedly to Trump appointees at the Defense Department. Katie Arrington, Michael Ellis, Adam Lovinger are some examples of that. Another part of the problem is the Inspector General, which I had gone to them to file a whistleblower retaliation claim, and they end up just carrying water for the bureaucracy. And so this is something I've looked into, and there's quite a few stories in a lot of different agencies about how these inspectors general, instead of being watchdogs, are essentially the lapdogs of the agency leaders. And that's particularly an issue that I think the new Trump administration should address. And I think they will, because they didn't really address it until near the end of the first term.
This angers me just hearing this. Our taxpayer money is going towards fulfilling some function for the service of the American people. I think that's my understanding of where the tax dollars should go. But instead, these so-called civil servants, you use that term very generously, are just enriching themselves on that money. How is that justice? How is our government supposed to function? How is America supposed to function if people are doing this?
Yeah, well, that's a great problem. I think that's one of the reasons we saw President Trump win the election. And he talked last time about draining the swamp. The Biden administration seems to have done very little. I think we see with Biden and other Democrats is they just love big government. And the more money that's spent on big government, the better. And they're not all that concerned about waste, fraud, and abuse. In fact, they're kind of worried that you'll find it, because then people might say, well, maybe we shouldn't be spending all of this money. So I think that is something that will be a top priority for the new administration, because there is a lot of this. I mean, contracting fraud alone is a huge cost. And we've seen with the COVID relief, for example, there are some indications we have of how bad it is. I mean, the Defense Department, if you look at their procurement, there is great corruption there. And so I'm hoping that with new agency heads, and also with the DOJ, with Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, are going to tackle some of these pressing issues and hold people accountable, because that's one of the biggest problems, is that people are afraid to hold other people accountable.
I can see why, if you get fired because of it. Well, what's the worst persecution you face because of this?
Well, having my security clearance suspended and then revoked is actually quite a bit worse than getting fired, because it affects your ability to get a future job. It's a bit like a doctor losing their medical license. Not only can you not do the job you're doing, but if you want to go somewhere else, they're going to say, well, you don't have security clearance. And I've actually been spent the last 4.5 years in a battle to get it back. I actually got it back a year after it was suspended, but then they came after me again. And then they've used a bureaucratic sleight of hand to block me from getting the supposed evidence that they claim to have. So I've sued them, and it's been almost 3 years that we're in the courts trying to get that evidence. And I'm hoping with the new administration, again, that we can speed things up, because the government bureaucracies could have been much more forthcoming. But under Joe Biden and Samantha Power, who is now the head of USAID, they've refused to carry out basic due process, which they are actually supposed to be doing.
How are you funding that suit?
Well, I'm fortunate to have lawyer who's been working on contingency, because otherwise it would simply bankrupt me. And we've seen this happen to a lot of people from the Trump first term who have faced these legal challenges. I mean, legal bills pile up very quickly. And we've seen, Michael Flynn is a good example, who basically lost everything, including his house, because he had these massive legal bills. And that's, of course, one of the main weapons they have against you, is the government can spend as much time and assign as many lawyers to the problem as they want, and they hope that they'll wear out your patience and your financial resources.
How do these people sleep at night? How do they walk around just knowing that they're stealing a lot of money from hardworking people?
That's a great question. I think people are able to rationalize these things. I think one of my guess is, and I don't think too many of them will come out about it, but I think a lot of them think, well, I've been a government employee, and I'm only making, $100,000 a year, and rich fat cats in Wall Street are making a lot more money, and they're not even doing important work. So I really deserve to be getting more than what the government's paying me. But it is rather remarkable, and also just how they justify going after people who are willing to actually report wrongdoing. I mean, so I know there's quite a few people in the government who know something about my case and could have done something. I mean, some are simply afraid to get involved themselves, but the ringleaders of this, I think, are pretty nasty people. Most of the people are so hungry for power and influence that they're willing to do almost anything.
Have you met those people?
Yes, several of them. And one of them, Rob Jenkins, this godfather figure, I saw him on a daily basis. He was in the same office I worked in, not same office, but under the same headquarters. So, and then when I ran into security clearance problems, I met a few of the security people initially, and also the so-called designated ethics official, who was known within the agency as the unethical ethics attorney because he was so dishonest. And so I had some interactions with them before I got fired. And since then, I haven't had any direct interaction. We've been filing lawsuits and requesting investigations. Jenkins, I do know, was actually fired on the day the book was released because of this and I think some other problems that had arisen. But some of these people are still working for the government, which is rather appalling. And again, I think a new administration will take a look and see who's been engaging in this sort of conduct.
Hey, well, congrats on getting Jenkins fired. So when you have these totally unscrupulous government officials, you have this unethical ethics attorney, I've always wondered, are these people happy? Do they have friends? Do they have like normal families?
That's a good question. I think what you see with a lot of them is that they are consumed by their work and their identity is wrapped up in their work. And one of the things I found through studying whistleblowers and whistleblower retaliation is that whistleblowers tend to be people who have who have an identity that goes outside the workplace. So oftentimes it may be related to their faith or their community or the nation. And those people, I think are what we need because they know that there's something more important than the organization. And the problem you have with a lot of these folks is, they're too wed to the organization. Yeah. And a lot of them, I think, do probably have some other issues going on. I will say there were plenty of good people I met in the federal government, but the problem is that the vultures are oftentimes the ones who are able to get power, and then they intimidate other people into going along.
I have to think that these people don't put much thought into the afterlife.
Yeah, I would say that's probably a fair statement. I do know at least one of the people in question was a noted atheist. We also did have within the agency, there was a lot of controversy over issues of religion. I had a little bit of involvement in that when I went to Africa, I was inquiring about our faith-based programs there, because that was something that the Trump administration was advocating. And I was told, and this is more than a year into the Trump administration, I was told that our Foreign Service officers weren't dealing with faith-based organizations because the Establishment Clause prevented it. And now, so I looked into this further. This is sort of left-wing interpretation of the Constitution that has been rejected by the courts. The Constitution does clearly allow this sort of aid that doesn't permit funding for proselytization, but for many other things like healthcare, education, you are certainly allowed to do that, especially in foreign countries that are not even subject to the Constitution. Underlying all of this is within the agency, there's a militant atheist faction that is especially opposed to religion because of issues over abortion and homosexuality. And they're so at odds with religious groups on those issues that basically they want to purge religion from the agency. And I know for the career staff, a lot of them are sort of in the closet when it comes to religion because they know that this militant atheist faction, is vicious and will destroy them. And I'm sure in the Biden administration, things have gotten worse. I mean, we had heard things were bad under Obama. With the Trump administration, you had many appointees, including senior ones, who were openly people of faith and wanted to incorporate faith into what the agency was doing. But once we left, I think it went back to the militant secularism.
What is the motivation of these militant atheists in the USAID agency?
Well, I think it's fundamentally that they adhere to the extreme egalitarianism of the left, which now we see extending to transgenderism, that transgender people are no different than anybody else, and to think otherwise is it's wrong. And, in their view, it's hateful, in fact, to oppose people who have these differing opinions. It is, I think, symbolic of the broader culture we have, the broader elite culture, where you have a lot of people on the left who are just entirely dismissive of other people's views and not only disagree, but sort of resent them, don't want to talk with them. And I do think that is to some extent a reflection of a lack of faith, because faith teaches you that everybody has dignity and is God's creation. And so you shouldn't be overly nasty. And you also should recognize that everyone makes mistakes and none of us is infallible.
Going back to the point of whether these unscrupulous, unconscientious individuals have any friends, whenever I see them or hear them speak, I just think, man, I would not want to go out to dinner with that person. I would not want to get a beer with that person. But when you're talking, I'm thinking, man, I'd love to go over to your house and have dinner with you, or these other whistleblowers. I don't even know who they are, but people who are willing to sacrifice the material goods for the sake of their conscience. Have you been able to get better friendships out of this?
I have become friends with a few other people who went through something similar, and we do have that common understanding of what's involved, and especially those who have had families. When you have a family that's depending on you for your livelihood, it becomes even more difficult because suddenly it's not just you who's in jeopardy, but your entire family. And so it has been a comfort to speak with people who have gone through something similar to this. And again, it's unfortunate how much we've seen of this in the Trump era. Seem to be a lot more people who got destroyed by the government. If you look at, you even have people going to jail like Peter Navarro and Steve Bannon on rather trivial grounds. I mean, they go after the president himself on these charges that no one else has ever been charged on. And so that does concern me, because I think the left is probably going to continue this politics of personal destruction, as it were, because they don't have much else left to do at this point.
Well, it seems like the only option is we got to clean house. We got 4 years to make this happen. And if it doesn't go through, then the effects could be disastrous.
Yes, it's going to be a big challenge. I think some people think the new administration can just go in and fire huge numbers of people, but there are unions and there are laws that protect these people, make it a lot more difficult than you would think. But I do know there are things you can do relatively quickly to at least change out the leaders. A lot of these career bureaucrats hold senior leadership positions, and those who are subversive, of whom there's too many, they need to be pushed out or pushed away. Ideally, you can find reasons to fire them. What happened last time mainly was, if there were cases of these bureaucrats out of hand, they would be put into some sort of job where they really don't do much, which doesn't hurt as much, but the taxpayer is still on the hook for paying these people their relatively large salaries to sit around and do nothing.
Do you have any hopes of being in the new administration?
Well, I'm always open to helping the country out, and they seem to have made some good choices so far, and I haven't been offered anything at this point, but I do think one of the biggest problems the first Trump administration faced was that they did not have enough time to bring in the right team, whereas this time they've had almost 4 years to think about who the good team would be. And so I think we've seen better picks of people who are both competent and also committed to the president's vision. One of the big problems, certainly in my agency, was that some of the people who came in were not really that interested in promoting the president's policies. They were in it for themselves. They wanted to have a credential, and some of them were actually engaged in various forms of corruption themselves. And I think most of those kind of people are not going to find their way into this administration. So that's a very good sign.
Do you know any of the current nominees?
I've met a few of them. I can't say I know any of them well, but I know a lot about them. People like Marco Rubio, Michael Waltz, Pete Hegseth are people I've been tracking for a long time. Kash Patel is another one who I'm quite familiar with his work. And these are people who I think in general are, they're smart, they're talented, they understand which way the administration wants to go. And so I think they're going to do great things.
Well, Kash Patel, head of FBI, I believe, that's a big role. What is your opinion on him in that role?
Yes. Well, the one thing I find, even people on the right are oftentimes fairly unfamiliar with the Crossfire Hurricane scandal and how the FBI was weaponized to try to destroy Trump. And it's really an extraordinary scandal in our history. And if it had been committed against a Democrat, I think you would hear the mainstream media talking about it as a second Watergate. But since it since Trump was the victim, a lot of the media has been silent on it, but I do think it was, criminal activity of historic proportions, and the Justice Department still has not fully gotten to the bottom of it. Now, a lot of the people involved in it have actually been forced out of the government, which is a good indication of how serious it was. But I think there's still a lot of digging to do. And we also have, with January 6th protesters, I think a lot of questions about why they went after people who had a very minor role in these protests, throwing them in jail, why they raided Mar-a-Lago, while they seem to turn a blind eye to Joe Biden possessing classified documents in his garage. So I do think you need somebody like him who's going to go in and aggressively ask all the right questions, because one of the things I saw from my time in administration is you have to understand how the bureaucracy works in order to stop it from misbehaving, because they capitalize on ignorance. And some of the appointees who came in, ones who were not particularly interested in the job, they basically let the bureaucrats do what they want. The bureaucrats would tell them how smart and wonderful they are, and they would say, okay, you bureaucrats have your hand up on this, continue doing what you're doing, which is how they got away with so much. So if you understand all the various methods of chicanery they have at their access, you can do much more to stop them. And Kash Patel, from his earlier career, including his time with Devin Nunes, I think has a good grasp about what sort of nefarious activities have been going on at the FBI.
Christian Crossfire. I've never heard of that.
That's Crossfire Hurricane. It was the investigation that was started with the FBI. Part of it was based on the Steele dossier, which was this fraudulent dossier about Trump, and also involved the spying on Carter Page with Kevin Kleinsmith, this FBI lawyer who falsified that document. Kleinsmith gets fired, although he ends up avoiding prison time. He's one of the most spectacular problems in all of this. But you have a lot of senior officials in the FBI who are weaponizing the FBI against the country's political leadership, which is an enormous threat to democracy, which actually we've heard a lot from the Democrats about supposed threats to democracy. But I do think that actually the only real threat to democracy has been this weaponization of the government against elected officials.
Well, it's a Soviet tactic. You just accuse your opponent of what you yourself are doing.
Absolutely. Yeah, we've seen a great deal of that from the Biden administration and its surrogates. Really unbelievable how so many times you hear them making accusations against the Trump administration or Trump and his supporters, and then you look and see, well, that's exactly what they themselves have been doing.
So you took a big step, you took a big risk rooted in your values. Was it worth it?
I think in retrospect, yes. It was very difficult and painful. I mean, I did not expect that they were going to be able to bring me down in the way they did. I had confidence in people above me in the bureaucratic chain, particularly political appointees, and did not expect that they would be so craven, nor did I realize exactly how well connected these bureaucratic bad actors were, that they had this ability to reach into different places and to orchestrate activities to destroy you. But I do think I would have very much regretted not doing something. Now, I was in a position of leadership, which has special obligations that come with it. And that's another reason, too, why I figured I could withstand this. Because usually when people think of whistleblowers, they think of some junior employee who sees something wrong and tells somebody, and then the organizational leaders come after them. But I was sort of a mid-level leader. So, but you also, one of the things I found too is that it's oftentimes sort of middle leadership, middle managers who are the victims of retaliation, because they tend to think that the upper leadership will have their backs. And it turns out a lot of times the top leaders are just concerned about saving their own skin. And so it was disappointing to me in that respect. I did, was able to write this book and hopefully reach people. I know some people who are going to be or thinking of being in the new administration are using it, because one of the main reasons I wrote it was to provide a guide for people who want to serve in the administration. That's one of the big problems too you had in the first Trump administration. There was really no effort to prepare new appointees for what they were getting into. Now, this is something else that's being addressed. I know that there's plans underway to have training modules so that you don't get thrown into the middle of this bureaucratic jungle with hostile creatures all around you without knowing what you're doing.
That's where Project 2025 comes in, I suppose.
They've been doing some work on that. I know America First Policy Institute and others have been devising some orientation programs. I'm not sure if any of them have been officially sanctioned yet, but I think just about everybody I know who was in administration says, yeah, we really need to do something like this so that we are not so vulnerable to bureaucratic sabotage.
What would you tell someone who is noticing corruption, whether in the government or in their own place of work, and they're afraid to speak up about it because of the loss that could incur? What would you tell them?
Yeah, well, I would say you've got to be careful. You have to be selective, pick your battles, because there's going to be some situations where you're almost certainly going to be the victim of retaliation. And so you've got to keep that in mind. One of the related issues is, do you make the complaint anonymously? And sometimes I think that is a good solution because that restricts your vulnerability. Now, in my case, that wasn't really an option because this was somebody working in my own office and I was dealing with it as a manager. Now, I will say too, sometimes the inspectors general will encourage you to disclose your identification because they'll say, well, that will help add to the veracity of your complaint. But I will caution that the inspectors general themselves have a lot of big corruption problems. So it is really important to try to find people you can trust. And that's difficult too, because a lot of times you may not know the people of sufficient influence in your organization. Excuse me. And another option too is going to the press. I mean, I did talk to the press. There again, the press usually, or oftentimes anyway, will conceal people's identity, but it's tough. I mean, and I said the biggest whistleblowers have an important role to play, but the single most important factor in stopping corruption is leadership, because the problems can be stopped at the top and the leadership sets the tone. And if you have leaders who are emphasizing ethical behavior and are punishing people when they find out about corruption, you'll have a good organization. But too often we don't see that.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if we can end on a hopeful note. What hope do you have in this new administration and just in where we are in society right now?
In terms of corruption?
Yeah.
I do think there are people who are coming in who really want to shake things up. And I think as part of that, I think most people of that mindset know that this swamp is deeply flawed and that there is this incestuousness between the government and contractors and lobbyists, and that something has to be done. Now, these problems are challenging, and the courts and lawyers are going to try to throw obstacles in their way. I don't think everything can be done in a single presidential term, but I do think there are some important battles that can be won. Some of this will involve legal action. There's something called Schedule F, which is being put in place to try to convert some of these career positions to political appointees. Political appointees are generally more accountable. You can fire them without confronting big union opposition. I do think you see more people of faith supporting President Trump. And oftentimes they are people who are particularly concerned about these ethical challenges. Another big area of crisis, I think, for the country is education. And we've seen it move at all levels really towards left-wing secularism and also just denigrating our traditions. And one of the reasons I came to Hillsdale College is we still require students to study Western civilization and American history, and those really provide the core of our ethics. And we see the left basically trying to strip those away. A lot of colleges, you don't have to take those courses anymore, and instead they're selling us DEI and these secular ideologies, which really are divisive. I mean, we're starting to see, fortunately, some backlash against these ideologies, but I think certainly this administration is going to be more friendly to the nation's traditions and will hopefully help restore those, especially in our educational system.
Dr. Mark Moyar, thank you for your witness.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to do what I can.